Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So,
Amen.
so of course, in this last part of Lech Lecha, I guess I'm just continuing. I want to get this, see how much of it we can do, even though the Parsha is Vayera, and possibly the next time we meet, we'll look at Vayera, but anyway, this is we're here. Abraham and God are having this conversation, you might say. This is where the whole idea of Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision, is introduced, and there are a whole bunch of various elements to do this. And God tells Abraham, of course, here that he and Sarah are actually going to father a son. Okay, have a son that Sarah is going to conceive even at the age of 90, etc. And Abraham is concerned that Ishmael, who is also his son, although not Sarah's biological son, should survive, and not only survive, but also walk with God too. Here is where God is reassuring Abraham. And I mentioned in our previous lesson that there's some very interesting universalistic elements to this part of the story, even as something very particularistic is being noted regarding the Jewish people, Abraham's descendants through Isaac. So, Ulayish, Ulayishmael Shematicha, and I have heard you literally regarding, in other words, I've heard your request. And when we say God hears our prayers, we usually mean that God accepts our prayers. So, and regarding Ishmael, I have heard you. Hine, behold, or indeed, Beirachti oto, I have blessed him. And again, I want to emphasize that this arcane word to bless generally in the Torah sense means to multiply, plenitude, plenitude. So there's a parallel here, right? I have blessed him, vehifreti oto, and I have made him fruitful, hirbeti oto, I've made him great, bima'od ma'od, very, very great. Shnei masar nisiim yolid, he will sire 12 princes, unatativ legoy gadol, and I will make him into a great nation. So let's take a look here. Here we are. All right. Shnei Masar Nesiim, 12 princes. Ki Ananim. Aha. So the rabbis are not altogether comfortable with giving Ishmael too much credit. Of course, the rabbinic period precedes Islam by a few, at least initially, right, by a few hundred years. But already here, they're not happy entirely with Ishmael's behavior, right? He is this hunter in a sense, all right? And so you'll see it when as I translate the Rashi, how they felt about it. But I will tell you, because of course there's this competition, right? This terrible competition between Ishmael and Isaac. And what happens though later on when Abraham dies, it talks about how Isaac and Ishmael go to bury their father Abraham. And the fact that even though Ishmael is the firstborn, he gives Isaac that position of being mentioned first. They talk about Ishmael doing tshuva towards the end of his life. At any rate, the word nisiim can also mean clouds. Ka'ananin hichalu. They shall disperse like clouds. And he gives an example in Proverbs 25, where the word nisiim here means clouds, veruach, and wind, clouds and wind. So, how one handles these kinds of statements. I'm afraid I'm a dyed in the wool on some levels liberal, and so I feel that more is done through kindness and accomplished through kindness than necessarily through harsh justice, etc. Although I think both kindness and justice are the foundations of God's throne, but one has to be very careful that justice is not personal justice. Any judge who enjoys giving sentence should be removed from the bench. And I remember actually speaking to a judge in St. Louis, who I was relatively close to, and who said that the worst day of the week, I think, was Friday. I believe Friday is the day called Sentencing Day. That's when they actually sentenced, and it felt pretty awful. So I I want to try to understand these things in a broader sense and to be careful. So things have very often to do with their contextual place. So onwards, right? Let's find the place here. Okay. Ve'et briti, however, my covenant akim et Yitzchak, I will establish it with Isaac. Asher teled lacha Sarah, whom Sarah will bear to you, lemoed hazeh, at this particular time, bashana ha'acheret, in at the next year. I don't know that there's Rashi on this. No, no Rashi on this. Vaychal ledaber ito, and he ceased to speak to him. Vayal Elohim me'al Avraham, and the Lord then, and Elohim God arose from Abraham, went up. See what this so me'al Abraham, so from above Abraham, literally. Lashon Nikiyahu. He says that this is, in some senses, a euphemism. Lashon Nikiyah, although there's another word for euphemism, it's Lashon Saginahor, language filled with light, which is an ironic way of discovering blindness. Someone who is blind is described as filled with light. Okay, so but he still says this is literally, it means clean language. Hu klape shchina. He says this is with respect to the divine presence. This is a lovely way of saying that God departed from Abraham, and me'al means above, right? So Sama, I believe that the implication here has to do with, the fact that even though on one level they're conversing with each other, converse, quote, quote, but nevertheless, we want to be careful not to put Abraham and God on the same plane, right? So, Vilamadnu, and we learn from this. This is Bereshit Rabbah, right? Bereshit Rabbah, Shahat Tzadikim, that the Tzadikim, the righteous, I love this, Merkavto Shel Makom, they are the chariot of the divine, right? Of the Holy One. So Me'al means above, right? So as if Abraham is below in the sense of the divine chariot, which Ezekiel speaks about. And it occurred to me, it must have been that I had this Rashi in mind when I read the Ezekiel and didn't remember the specific Rashi here, but realized that talking about the divine chariot in Ezekiel was actually a reference to the patriarchs, which still begs a question, why Dafka a chariot? So let me analyze that for you a moment. A chariot was used in ancient warfare to get a person from one place to another in a hurry. That's why generally chariots had just two wheels, because with two wheels they could maneuver more nimbly, and they could also move as quickly as possible. And likewise, the righteous, if I am correct, and that the purpose that we have as human beings is to be conduits of the divine into this world, that is the ultimate dynamic of being a righteous person, is that you try to bring the divine into this world, that in that sense, the righteous, as Rashi's describing here, allow God to be everywhere and anywhere. And that's why they're described as this chariot, because wherever they go, they bring a sense of the divine. So that's the reason for this metaphor.
Just to digress very briefly on the chariot,
Yes.
I've been reading, or with my group in Akron, Chagiga,
Ah,
in
yes.
which there
Yeah.
is a lengthy,
Right.
lengthy chapter on the
Hmm.
chariot and all
Yes.
kinds of interpretation, midrash, and
Uh-huh.
interactions with the
Yeah.
rabbis
Yes.
who
Go on.
try to get to the chariot.
Yes. Well, hopefully, from what you've read in Chagiga, it doesn't contradict what I'm sharing with
No,
you.
it doesn't at all, but it
Oh,
expands on it
right.
to
Oh, I'm sure.
an incredible degree. Okay.
Yes, yes.
I'm
No, no,
happy.
no. I'm very happy with that
Yeah.
digression. Thank you.
All
Thank you.
right.
So, going on to 23 here. Vayikach. So Abraham's just finished talking with God, right? That's the point here, right? Just finished. God has just given him this command to circumcise himself, all the people in all the males in his encampment, right? And part of expressing love, right? We talk very greatly about love. Very often, you'll allow me my editorial sermonic comment that we confuse love with lust. They are not the same. Love is a behavior, and basically that involves putting someone else in front of yourself. And lust is basically selfish. It is satisfying needs. Okay. So love, part of expressing love is that when you put someone else's will before your own and you don't take 10 years to accomplish it, in other words, the speed with which you accomplish that will is also an act of love. So if someone asks you that you claim to love, asks you to do something, you do it as soon as possible. You don't wait another 3 weeks or whatever. But generally speaking, you try to get it done because it becomes a priority for you to fulfill their desires. And that's part of what we mean when you love someone. So, at any rate, this makes the point. Vayikach Avraham et Yishmael beno. Abraham took Ishmael, his son. And I think the fact, it could have just said Yishmael, and the fact that it says beno, I think, is implying the love that Abraham had for Yishmael, right? The et kol yilidei veito, and all those born in his household. The et kol miknat kaspo, and all who had been purchased through his money, purchased by money, right? Kol Zachar, look at this list, right? Of Kol Zachar, all the males, Ba'anshe Beit Abraham, of the people in the house of Abraham, Vayamol et Basar Ulatam, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins. Be'etzem hayom hazeh. This is the point. Be'etzem, in that self same day, right? They told to do it, did it right away. This is what Be'etzem hayom hazeh is trying to emphasize. Ka'asher diber ito Elohim, just as the Lord had spoken to him. And of course, this is one of the 10 tests which Abraham did, and he passed with honors in the fact that he didn't hesitate to do this. This, this, of course, realistically, this would be a tremendous thing to accomplish, right? So Rashi hones in on Be'etzem Hayom, right? In Etzem. Uh, it means in some ways the strength of the day. Atzamot are bones. They're the strong part of the human frame, right? So I'm sure that sometimes etzem can also have something to do with essentials, something like that. So he says, Bo bayom shenitztaveh, right? Uh, on the very day that he was commanded, bayom velo balayla, in the day and not at night. He didn't do it in secret. He did it openly, right? Lo nityare, he was not afraid. He wasn't fearful. Lo min hagoyim, not from the nations. Velo ha min haletzanim, and not from the scoffers, people who would try to mock him for doing such a thing. And we know people have a very visceral reaction to the idea of circumcising males, right? To this very day. But he wasn't afraid of it. He did it. Veshelo yiyu oivav, and that his enemies, uvnei vodor, and the people of his generation, right? So in other words, his enemies and the people of his generation, omrim, say, ilu ra'inuhu, right? Were we to see him, they're not going to be able to say this anymore because he's doing it in daylight, broad daylight. Lo hinachnuhu lamo. We would not have allowed him to circumcise, ulukayim mitzvato shel makom, or to establish or perform the commandment of the divine. We wouldn't have allowed him to do it. We would have stood up against it. So we have this phrase, Be'etzem Hayom, also with Noah going into the ark, and there's a very similar interpretation that that Noah entered the ark in that day, in other words, during the day, and the idea of day right openly and without fear that he would be prevented by the people who didn't want him to get it done. In some ways, of course, this is also describing God's will, that Noah and Abraham understood the divine will and were not going to be prevented from doing it openly, despite the fact that there were people who might scoff or physically try to prevent it and claim greater strength that they're capable of undermining divine will. So there's some deep stuff going on here. I've noticed more recently as I've come to pray, and these days I love praying. I find it a very comforting act, but the prayers are just filled with this expressed yearning for the divine rule amongst human beings. And in some ways, of course, this is a reflection of that tragically, despite the fact that human beings were created by the divine, that is the ultimate beginning of all these processes that we experience, the fact that in fact that we are blessed in a million and one ways, so many of which we are not even aware of, the complexity of the human body, the fact that we are given an intellect that is capable of just amazing things, and yet the fact that we have little to no sense of appreciation of where this comes from. And I will also underscore that if you're able to develop a heart that is appreciative, a thankful heart, you will discover joy. This is where happiness is to be found, because you're conscious, you become conscious and aware of the many ways that we are actually gifted in this world. So, Vayamo, so he says he circumcised, and he says, Lashon Vayifal, meaning he did something. He's saying that this is, I believe, Hifil, that there are constructions in Hebrew, 7 different constructions. There is Kal, which is a straight, simple verb. There is Nifal, which is the passive voice. There is PL, which is generally a more intensive. There's Pu'al, which is the passive of PL. There's Hifil, which is causative, where you are causing that action on someone else. And there's Hofal, which is the passive of that. And there's Hitpa'el, which is a reflexive form. These are forms, grammatical forms, that a verb will take. Not every verb does this, but there's some good ones. So, for example, lovesh, lamed beit shin, that root, lovesh means to wear, right? Lovesh. Hilbish, right, which is the hifel form, causative, means to dress someone, right? To dress someone would be hilbish. And then hitlabesh means to dress yourself. That's the reflexive. So there are 3 examples of that particular root that take that form there. All right, so let's say here, is there anything more on this? Let's see if Rashi goes on here. No. For Avraham, and we go on to say, just want to make sure I don't want to miss any. Yes, okay. For Avraham ben Tish'im v'Tesha Shana, and Abraham was 99 years, behimolo besar orlato, when he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, right? Or when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. But I do believe it means he's circumcised. And here Rashi is giving us some grammatical notes. Rashi does certainly do this from time to time, right? Behof olo. So again, this is this passive form of the verb. Kamo behib aram. That is in chapter 2, when it says it's referring, the word bara means to create, behib aram, which means when they were created. So when he behimolo means when he was circumcised. Right. There's a footnote here, right? This may be from a different manuscript that the editor of this particular edition put in. That's why there are the parentheses here. The question as to why it's in parentheses, perhaps it's that. Sometimes I can tell you that in the Gemara, when you're studying Talmud, because that there were censors and various, you can imagine copying these things was amazing long before printing, right? That very often, if you see something in parentheses, it means there's something in the text that shouldn't be there, that it isn't perhaps an original part of the text. And if it's in square brackets, then it means something that needs to be added to the text. But, the actual examination of the text itself, and there are various editions of Rashi, and there's a level of scholarship where scholars look at even very slight differences in the transmission of Rashi. At any rate, Bihimolo, Natal Avraham Sakin. Abraham, so this is a drush on this. Abraham took a knife, v'achaz be'orlato, and he held on to his foreskin, v'ratza lachtoch, and he wanted to cut. V'haya mityare, but he was concerned, he was afraid, shehaya zaken, that he was aged, ma'asa, so he was worried, in other words, that he would somehow not perform the surgery correctly. You realize it may not be the most complicated form of surgery. I mean, I think as surgeries go, generally it's not considered complicated, although there always the possibility of complications, and possibly there are sadly and tragically sometimes instances where something happens and it's not a good situation, but that he might cut off too much, something like that. Me'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is what he was worried about. He wasn't worried about the actual performance, right? And the pain that might inflict on him. He was worried that he might not do a good job, and consequently that he would damage his member. Okay. So what did the Holy One do? What did he do? What did the Holy One do? Shalach Yado, he sent forth his hand, that is metaphorically God's hand, right? Va'achaz imor, and he held on with him. He was there with Abraham when he did this. Shene'emar, and how do we get this? It says, Ve'karot imo habrit, that he cut with him the brit, the covenant, right? Imo, with him. In other words, the idea of the divine. Of course, saying the hand is metaphoric, right? Obviously, generally hands, that metaphor has to do with power and the ability to accomplish. Hands have that metaphoric and poetic meaning, right? Is effectiveness, something like that. Legs, for example, have to do with going, with moving around, with being present, something like that. So different parts of the body have different metaphoric meaning and significance. So they're taking this and seeing it on a certain level, taking it literally, right? Lo lo le'emar. It doesn't say he cut lo, to him the brit. In other words, the word lo is not used in the sense. It doesn't say the karot lo habrit. In other words, that God established his covenant with him. Lo means for him, or to him. Lo ne'emar, that's not what is said. Ela imo, but it says with him, with him. And here we go. He's telling you the source of this. So this midrash is in Bereshit Rabbah and Rashi Yashan. So Rashi Yashan must mean, I'm going to assume it means earlier versions of the Rashi, of Rashi. So I'm going to keep going because we're so close to the end, and to keep going. And there's not a lot of Rashis here. So let's keep going. All right. Here we go. Be'etzem hayom, right? Notice we repeat that phrase, right? In that very self-same day, Nimol Avraham. Abraham was, and now we've got another version of this word. Abraham was circumcised. Nimol, this is a passive form of the verb. V'yishmael b'no, and Ishmael his son. Again, please notice this use of the word his son here. It could have just said Nimol Avraham v'Yishmael. Could have just said Abraham and Ishmael. We would have understood the same basic meaning. So what does the word b'no add, right? His Ishmael, his son, right? Okay. Well, we'll see if I don't know if Rashi's. We'll see. But my thought here is that as a parent, you're less concerned about your own safety than your child's safety. And again, and Ishmael at this point was 13 years old, right? So was probably concerned. There might be that implication of this here. V'chol anshe beit. Let's see. We got a right. We do have a Rashi on this. Let's take care of it. Be'etzem hayom hazeh. Shemil'u Avraham tzetet shana. That is to say that Abraham was fully 99 years old. Ulishmael shlosha asrei. Shloshes Reishanim, and Ishmael at this point was a full 13 years old. Nimol Avraham v'Ishmael beno. The two of them, that is Abraham and Ishmael, his son, were circumcised. So, going on. V'chol anshe beito, and all the people of the men of his household, Yalid Bayit, the ones born in the house, in his household, Mikna Kesef. Notice this repetition of this phrase. I believe the reason for that is that it's the way in which legal, this gives it a legal sense. This is one of the few mitzvot, okay, that you find in Genesis, and the way it's stated. And we know that when it comes to legal language, part of the reason why legal language can be so redundant is that we want to be as clear as possible as to what we're saying, because the implications may well be very great. So we have this repetition, partially to imply the legality of all this, but I think also to tell you that Abraham was meticulous about performing this particular commandment. As there's a general, of course, dynamic within Judaism to perform in particular ways and in very specific ways these commandments. It's also, in other words, the degree of detail with which you perform commandment. Again, speed, detail, these are all ways in which one exhibits love, right? How much do you care? Caring is the underscore. So, uh, so the people born in his household, people that were purchased, Me'et ben Nechar, from strangers, and I think the idea is that they weren't in any way related. They were not descendants in any way of Abraham. Nimolo ito, they were circumcised with him, and that's the end of this parsha of Lech Lecha. So again, I feel this is somewhat of an underscoring of a universalistic sense of the Torah here. And we will conclude Lech Lecha with this.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how old was Yitzchak at the Akedah?
That's a very good question, Mars. There are various opinions about how old he was. Some say, I think that he was 30, maybe 30, 36, something like that.
How
Okay.
does that make sense if Yishmael is 13 and he's
The
done
Akedah,
later on?
okay. So remember, uh, you're not confusing the Akedah with Brit Milah. We are told, of course, that Isaac was circumcised at 8 years of age, 8 days of age, forgive me. So in other words,
Yes,
Ishmael was 13 years older than Isaac, essentially.
but we've
Or,
already had
14 years old, sorry.
didn't
14
we
years
have
old.
the Akedah already? No. Oh, that's the
The
follow. I'm sorry.
Akedah, right, the Akedah comes at the end of the next parsha of
Okay.
Vayera and
Okay.
precedes Kaye
Sorry.
Sarah. No problem. So I will tell you that I had come across many years ago a Tosafot on the Parsha. The edition of the Chumash that I had a Tosafot on the Rashi, where essentially the way it's figured out has to do with how old, how do you place Right. Okay, here we go. Here's very simply how you figure out how old Isaac was. How old was Sarah when Isaac was born? 90 years old. How old was she when she died? 126. It says it in Chaye Sarah that
Yeah.
Sarah was 126 years when she died. If you say there is many famous midrashim that essentially say Sarah died at the Akedah, that Satan showed her what her husband was doing to her son, and her soul departed at that site. So, in other words, if she died at 126 and she was 90 when Isaac was born, how old was Isaac at the Akedah? A simple arithmetical problem. He was clearly 36 years old. All right. Tosafot, and I wish I remembered the details of that particular comment, show that one doesn't have to go in that direction. Okay. On some hands, yeah, I'm trying to think. I think we do actually know how old Isaac was. Now, unfortunately, my specific memory is not good here, but it's a matter of going to the Torah. We know that he was 40, I believe, when he married Rebecca. So, in other words, 4 years passed from the Akedah to the point where he met Rebecca and married her, which in some ways makes sense because it says after he marries Rebecca that he was consoled for the death of his mother. These are statements in the Torah itself. So just working out these chronologies is
No,
interesting.
I always thought it was 36, but I was confusing the timing here.
Right, right. No, we will come to the Akedah at the very end of Parsha Vayera, at the end.
Very good.
He isn't even born yet, right? He's not even born yet. Okay, so with that, I'll stop the recording, but appreciate your raising the question always.